All right, so we'll start. Let me introduce myself a little bit. Obviously, I'm a vet. I have time in political office. I have time in the war. I have time as an activist. Those are the three key pieces of my life. My interest in international law came from two things. It came, one, from civil resistance and being in courts. It came also from being in Gaza and in war and seeing the value of international law. Kind of an agenda. So generally, what is international law? Then we'll go into why do we care about international law, and then we'll go into a little bit about defending ourselves using international law, an overview of Nuremberg. The point that international law is not a separate law; it's part of our law. We talk about Nuremberg principles, so we can talk about enforcement. That's my plan. So, what is international law?
So it's law which is agreed by among people of different countries or the governments of different countries.
It's both treaties and United Nations agreements, multilateral agreements. So either bilateral treaties or multilateral treaties.
Multilateral treaties, which of course the UN is.
Or entities like the Inter-American Court.
Court, yeah, which was created by treaty. Yeah. What is really fascinating about international law is that the premise of it is, as we talked about, there is treaty law, laws by treaties, which is like lack of law, like code law. And there's also customary law. Customary law says there are certain principles that are so fundamental in society that regardless of your religion, regardless of your nationality, regardless of your ethnicity, you think these things are right. Let me ask you this. What do you think would happen if somebody, let's just say the U.S. decided to prosecute the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or Colombia or someplace by moving in and killing all the women from the age of 6 to 14? Huh? That's wrong, right? Everybody would say it's wrong, right? That's customary law. And the idea behind customary law is that it's customary law. It doesn't matter whether you sign an agreement. It doesn't matter whether you sign a treaty. You're still bound by it. Was customary law used in the Nuremberg trials? Absolutely. We tried German jurists, German judges, for enforcing law, which was black letter. Do you know what I mean by black letter law? Black letter law is law that was written out in black and white letters and approved. You know, it's the kind of law you can find in a book, right? As opposed to customary law. So we prosecuted judges for enforcing black letter law in Germany because that law was a violation of customary law. So it's really important, and it affects everybody. Now, if we look at the big picture of international law, you have customary law, and fundamentally, international law is based on customary law. And then you have public law and private law. Private law is between an individual and a state, between individuals across states, that kind of stuff. Public law is what affects states, whole states, state governments. When you break it down, you break it into international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Maybe you know the difference? All you vets? First, international humanitarian law is the law that governs armed conflict. Armed conflict. Internal, external, international, within a state. So, Geneva Convention, Hague Conventions, Nuremberg principles are all part of international humanitarian law. International human rights law is outside of the conflict. And so, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, etc. There are a whole bunch of them. And these are treaties. Interestingly enough, these can be suspended because you have extreme situations, a tsunami, a war, they can be suspended. These can't be because they deal in extreme situations. Curious.
Yeah, international law is complicated. Who does suspend them? Well, there isn't a cut and dry answer.
A nation might say, you know, no, you can't sue us. You can't prosecute us for that because we were in the middle of a national disaster, and we just couldn't deal with human rights.
So let me just step ahead. Prosecution is a complicated process. If we're in the middle of a war, what am I going to say to him? I'm charging your soldier XYZ for. He did commit an international crime, right? So that's a complicated problem. So what we've done is, what they did is they did a couple of things. One is they came up with this idea of universal jurisdiction. What does that mean? They said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to say this. These two guys are in a fight. And we know they're committing war crimes. Look at Israel-Palestine. We know they're both committing war crimes. We know they can't prosecute each other. It just isn't going to work. What we say is every single nation, not over here, who's got no dog in our fight. Neither one of us are a part of his nation. It's not happening in this nation. It didn't happen in this nation. He does not involve in it. But because of universal jurisdiction, he has jurisdiction to prosecute. Right? Kind of a clever idea. Tricky legally. A lot of issues. One of the things that's fascinating about international human rights law in general is, you know, it's not very old. 1907 was the first Hague Agreement. One thing I want to pick out of that too is we talk about conventions. We're not talking about conferences. We're talking about conventions as in agreements. In international law, conventions usually refer to agreements. So the 1949 Geneva Conference had 4 conventions came out. Let's see. So why do we give a damn about international law? Why do you care about international law? Or don't you?
No, I think we absolutely need something that governs interactions between states, and the whole issue of kind of universal jurisdiction. We have an interest, moral interest in what happens within states when it goes beyond certain limits.
So how does that apply to us on the ground in the United States? Yes.
Well, I think the question might also be, do our leaders care about international human rights law?
I'm going to tell you about our leaders. They care if we make them.
Well, I'll go along with that. Let's make them.
Right now, I want to talk about why it affects us. So this is a good point. How does it affect us, you and I? It affects you and I in a lot of ways. It affects us in our resistance. Why? Because if I go to court for trespassing, discon, incommoding, that's the one in DC, I love that one, in DC, whatever it is.
Ingress or egress.
Aggravated blocking of the traffic. Anyway, whatever they call those various things. If I can go in with the international law, right, and I go on to the Nuremberg Principles, the Nuremberg Principles give me either what they sometimes call a Nuremberg privilege, sometimes call a Nuremberg obligation, which says that I am legally responsible for any complicity that I have in war crimes. How many people have paid taxes? And those taxes were used for war crimes. So my point being is that our government's complicit in war crimes. If we aren't trying to block them by Nuremberg, we are essentially guilty. We are trial. That's what happened in Germany. There were 1,600 people tried in the Nuremberg trials in Germany, 5,700 tried in the Tokyo trials. You know, one of the key pieces of Nuremberg was to say that you can't try individuals for commission of war crimes because you can't try some amorphous theoretical thing like a government. That was Jackson's. So, why do we care about Nuremberg? Why do we care that international laws enforced in our local courts? Because if we get stopped for protesting, what do you want to protest? Drones, war, what do you want to pick one?
Weaponized uranium.
Weaponized uranium. If we want to protest the fact that the weaponized uranium. A bomb is illegal by international law. It is obviously an indiscriminate weapon. Right? It's as indiscriminate as you can freaking get. If we had international law, if we can bring that into court, central to our cases, absolutely central to our cases, are the weaponized uranium a war crime? That's central to our case, because if it is a war crime, we're using our Nuremberg privilege, and therefore we're innocent. Right? And then here's another thing too. Have you ever seen an unjust law in this country? Have you ever seen a law that was unjust? Have you ever seen a law that violated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yeah, I lived in Memphis in the 50s.
What's that?
I said I lived in Memphis in the 50s.
And even if we were enforcing international law in local courts, we could take these laws that get passed, which are really wrong, and we could put them up against the measure of the International Declaration of Human Rights in a local court. And if we were enforcing international law in local courts, we could prosecute war criminals. I don't know if we have any. I'm not talking about you guys aren't doing that. And in fact, Jackson in the Nuremberg trials said it's really important that we don't try little guys. He said that doesn't do any good. You got to try the big guys who make the decisions. And if you look at Nuremberg, that's what they did. They went after the big guys. So, if we can get if we can have international law enforced in local courts, we can prosecute our war criminals, our presidents. And you know, one of the problems we have is that they can control the federal courts. You know, a few federal judges. Well, what would happen if we got out there and we got 1% of all the local courts to swear out a warrant for Bush? Or what if it wasn't even 1%? What if it was only 1,000 of them? Excuse me, sir, we have to get off the thruway because the next town has a warrant out for you. Excuse me, sir, we got to back up. Yes. So I think, let me go to another part, which is this whole question of enforcement. Basically, international law is enforced in domestic courts. It always balked at some kind of overall power. So it's been left to domestic courts. So who's responsible for international law being enforced in our courts? I use one word just before courts, in our courts. Yes.
No, I think that's right. I think that it's left to the individual because there's a distinct separation between government and the people in every country in the world, no matter what their political philosophy and structure is. And they leave the onus up to citizens to do the things that they won't do on their own because of the threat that it will pose to them.
That's right. How many people believe we have a democracy? How many people want a democracy? Is somebody going to give you a democracy? Can somebody give you a democracy? Well, where does it come from then?
From us.
We exercise your own.
From us.
From us?
Yeah.
We have power?
Yes, we do.
Right.
I said only if we use that power.
Did you ever hear Frederick Douglass?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember he said, the limits on tyrants are prescribed by the patience of the oppressed.
Yes,
That's right.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and talk about the chain of law of why I argue that the international law has to be part of our government.
Just say there's a prejudice against it.
Oh, there is. I'm going to tell you something. I have never had any judge admit international law. Yeah. I'll tell you, the judge in Quantico put it perfectly. She said, I find you guilty of I think it was aggravated blocking of the traffic as charged. And as for those lofty ideas of international law, they have no place in my court. Right? What does the U.S. Constitution say? Constitution, and all treaties made which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and judges of every state should be bound thereby, and anything in the Constitution was otherwise doesn't count.
That's right.
What's complicated?
Very simple.
But here's the point. We have many laws on the books that do not get enforced, and we have laws that aren't on the books that do get enforced. What causes that? Why does that happen? Why? Let me ask you this. Why do we have a law on the book that doesn't get enforced? But I'm just asking, what's the mechanism? I'm going to tell all of you.
People make money.
What's that mean?
People make money.
People make money? Here's what I would argue. There isn't the political will to enforce the law. There isn't the political will to enforce the law. If I'm a cop, if I'm a town board, I know pretty well that I'm going to catch hell if that law is enforced. I'm not going to want my enforcement officers enforcing it. That's the battle I try to get enforcement officers to enforce every law in the book, because I knew damn well if the board was forced with them, they had a real human being who was being hurt by the law, they'd get rid of it. But the enforcement officer wouldn't do it because it's a political position too, because he knew the board would be mad at him. But anyway, here's the essence. And I'll carry this one step further. When I was a young man, I believed our rights were guaranteed by a body of laws. The U.S. Constitution, that's being enforced, isn't it? The Bill of Rights, that's being enforced. Every judge would tell you, they only use part of the phrase. They say the law is the law. And what they always leave off is the part which is not there, but it is real, which is except for when it's not. I've been arrested for driving cars barefoot. There's not a single state in the union that's got a law against driving barefoot. But I've been arrested for it. Because there's a public perception that that's the law. There's a public perception that you can't be barefoot in businesses. That's why they put signs on the thing, no barefoot, no shoes, no shirt, no service. They believe they're following a law that doesn't exist. So it's all a question of public perception and public domain. That's what I believe. Same thing's true of international law. In Europe, they believe that international law should be enforced. In this country, we had a discussion about whether torture was legal. We have, I bet there's 6 or 7 or 8 or 10, I don't know how many treaties there are that says it's illegal. Treaties that specifically talk about waterboarding. I mean, there's just no question in international law what is true of both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It's illegal. It is illegal, point black letter law, but in this country we had a discussion about it because we didn't have the perception. In social, 2004, for 2 centuries, we have affirmed that the domestic law of the United States recognizes the law of nations. No, the Supreme Court has never interpreted Article 6 as just saying Article 6 because they can't do that. They can only do it in the case of an actual case. They can't do theoretical cases. Okay.
Okay, so it hasn't been.
Here's one. It is, of course, true that the United States applies international law as part of our own in appropriate circumstances. But this is a very important thing. International law is part of our, I think this is 1900, sorry, I don't have to say that. International law is part of our law. It must be ascertained and administered by the courts of justice of appropriate jurisdiction as often as questions of right depending upon it are duly presented for the determination. But they can't just say, they couldn't say you have to, because that wouldn't make sense either. They couldn't just say they have to always enforce it because maybe it didn't apply. There is not a judge who is, I said this before, there is not a judge or a lawyer who has given me a single, or one single argument for why these don't apply. The court is bound by the law of nations, which is part of the law of the land. And this is really important. I don't really want to bring this out. One of the things really important to understand is international law is not a separate law.
Yeah.
Go back to the Constitution. Shall be the supreme law of the land. And judges of every state is part of our law. To enforce domestic law, local law, to enforce local law without incorporating international law is exactly the same as trying to enforce domestic law without enforcing. So, where I'm going with this is
this point of how's it going to be, is that for us to sit here and cry in our beer, maybe a beer? I missed that. For us to cry in our beer about international law not being enforced in this country is dodging the issue. It's not going to happen unless we make it. Is that?
The U.S. isn't even a member of the World Court of Law.
But we don't have to do it in the World Court. International law is usually enforcing domestic laws. We could be trying our war criminals right now. And in fact, we could be trying them on domestic law too, because we have a whole bunch of domestic laws that they're violating, but that's another issue, because very often our domestic law reflects international law, because that's part of the enforcement mechanism, is that you pass domestic laws that reflect international law so that you have a mechanism for enforcing it.
I was gonna ask you, so how do we do it? How do we enforce that?
How do we make it happen?
How do we make it happen?
Okay, one thing is that international law requires governments during times of peace to educate the public about international law. What did you tell me about Europe? Who just told me about Europe? What did you tell me about? Didn't you say something about the way the Europeans have a different attitude towards international law than we do?
Yes,
What's the difference?
they take it seriously.
Can you hear him?
They all have a sense of it. You talk to somebody on a train and they're more likely to say, oh, but that's against international law.
Public perception, public expectation. That's the biggest key thing, is public expectation. You know, I was in my last trial before Judge Gideon up in Hancock. I suddenly realized I had this moment, because I wasn't there. I was on the West Coast when the judgment was passed down. I had read his judgment before I went to sentencing, so I knew what he was going to say. And I thought, this is a moment. I have no case before this judge, so I don't have to worry about any ex parte communication. During sentencing, the tradition is they pretty much let you do whatever you want to do. You know, go ahead, do it. This is your time. It's not constricted by the usual descriptions of the court, usual constrictions of the court. And I thought, this is an opportunity to engage the judge on how in the hell he's dodging this issue. How is he dodging the issue that international law applies here? You know what I got? First of all, he could stop the whole thing anyway, which means he said, I decided it before, I'm not going to decide again. He decided totally wrong, but he's not going to decide again. But the other thing, his answer, I said, look, we have 6 Supreme Court rulings where I gave you citations, six Supreme Court cases that say that you need to enforce this in your court. Can you tell me why you think you don't have to do it? You know what his answer was? I interpret the law differently than you do. And you can also go to the Air Force law. Let's see. Force of treaties under the Constitution. Under the Constitution of the United States, treaties constitute part of the supreme law of the land. Article 60+2. In consequence, treaties related to the law of war have force equal to that of laws enacted by Congress. Their provisions must be observed by both military and civilian personnel with the same strict regard for both the letter and the spirit of the law, which is required with respect to the Constitution and the statutes enacted pursuant thereof. That's the U.S. Army. Remember that? I mean, we all know.
I definitely heard.
Yeah, but we all know we were charged with complying with Geneva Conventions. I think it comes back to what I think you said and you said, which is it's a matter of our getting familiar with the law, so we understand it, demanding, building the expectation in the American public that it will be enforced. I told you about my talking to Judge Gideon, about in my sentencing statement, trying to engage him on the law. And I walked out of the court and realized, I'm never going to win in this court. I'm not going to get where I want to go. What I need to go is go to the people who elect him and build a public perception, not a perception, an understanding of how important these laws are for us and how they are the law and they need to be enforced. And if the public demands it of him, just like the horse laws, just like the shoe laws, all these laws which are borderline either being enforced and they aren't the law or aren't being enforced and they are the law because of public support for it. Customary law has the same validity as black and white ratified treaty. They do.
And that's why we were able to try Germans. There were 13 trials. So that there's a black and white, there's a black letter law and there's the customary law. They're both very, very important. We are certainly enforcing some portions and not enforcing other portions. There's lots of black letter law under international humanitarian law we aren't enforcing. We did it. You have?
Yeah.
Not?
No.
How many were not? Legally required to follow the Geneva Conventions, or international law. You just saw what the manual says. Army field manual says. We were given we were faced with a choice. Do you follow what I express is, do you follow the big laws and small laws, which is the same choice I say judges are faced with today in the courts. Do you follow the big law or the small? The law that saves millions of lives, or the laws that affects a few people? Was I going to follow? And I can tell you what I did. I did not follow the Geneva Conventions. I followed the little laws. The little laws like the rules of engagement and the direct orders of my commanders. And they were illegal laws. And I was not only violating international law, I was violating the UCMJ. Because the UCMJ charges me with not following an unlawful law order, an unlawful order is an order that violates the Supreme Court, which is violating international law. So, do we want to talk more about how we create this change? I think it's a really important issue. I think it's a burning issue. So you were saying, and you were saying you need to figure out a hook, what we call a hook, which is kind of what you were saying. We need to start. In other words, it's got to start somewheres. You know, it's like the old saying: if not me, who? If not me, who? If not now, when?
This is what's it like when you try to apply the races? You're saying we have this defense. You try to raise this defense in court, and the judge says this just doesn't apply in the story here.
I have never gotten a judge to do it. But I've also never gotten a judge I had one judge give me a rationale that the Nuremberg principles were not ratified, which is correct. U.S. Congress did not ratify the Nuremberg. Do you know what the Nuremberg? Let's talk a little bit about Nuremberg. So, what do you think I mean when I say Nuremberg?
Trial in Germany after
After World War II.
Okay, trials in Germany. Incidentally, when I was being arrested in Biel, the Biel Air Base, none of the arresting officers in uniform, U.S. Air Force, knew what Nuremberg was. Even when I said, like World War II, end of World War II, they didn't know what it was. Why was Nuremberg important?
It held individuals accountable for.
Wait.
It made individuals responsible for their actions.
It made individuals responsible for their actions. For the actions of the state.
Right.
So there's a couple of things. One of the things is a little bit like the Keller-Briand Treaty that really changed things. Do you remember what? So we ended World War II. We were victors. So there's this question of, okay, how do you make sure this doesn't happen again? Do you remember what Stalin's proposal was? Take the top 50,000 German leaders and execute them. I mean, top 50,000 German leaders and execute them.
That sounds like Stalin.
Good start.
Good start. Churchill thought that was excessive. He said we could probably do it with 5,000.
Such a reasonable.
Well, it's really interesting to understand because that was the concept at that time. It was radical to say, no, we could put these people in the court. It was so radical, we had to have what we call the Nuremberg Charter. There's three things that are important in Nuremberg.
So how many people did we hang? 100? 130?
I don't know. We tried 1,600 in Germany. There's a charter, the judgment, and the principles.
The charter, nobody done this before. The charter was what did a couple of things. One is it established that there would be a court. It established that, an interesting thing it established jurisdiction, saying these crimes occur all over the place. It doesn't matter whether they occurred in Germany or one of the occupied countries. We're going to try them in this court. It says we're going to have a court. The accused are going to have a right to a defense. And a lot of them got off. They got lesser charges, and a lot of them got found innocent. So it set up the whole process. It also established the idea of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace were established by the charter. The judgments, which are the judge's rulings. So this is treaty. This is court law. Because this is what the courts found. And then the principles in 1950, the UN said to charge the International Law Committee to go and look at the charter and look at the judgment and pull out of that the principles of law, of customary law that were established by these two. Make sense? Now, this was never ratified by the US. On the other hand, in 1950, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution saying that we accept the principles of law established by the Charter and the judgment as being customary law, passed unanimously by the General Assembly. Basically, regardless of whether this was ratified or not, no nation has seriously challenged the question of whether the judgment, whether the principles of whether the Nuremberg principles did represent customary law or not. And if they represent customary law, they apply, and they apply whether you sign any treaties or not. Or forceful on you whether you sign a treaty or not. So, it was a radical division. It also established the idea that, you know what I mean by superior order defense? In other words, I'm not guilty because I was just following orders.
Yeah.
They said, no, that doesn't work. Another common defense was, excuse me, I am the king. I not only am above the law, I am the law. You can't try me. And Nuremberg said, nah, that don't work anymore. We just got rid of that. So Nuremberg did a lot of really important stuff. And the thing that's probably most important, at least most important for us, is it said the only way we're going to prosecute, the only way we're going to stop these war crimes and stop these wars is by making individuals responsible if they're complicit in a war crime. And part of what they said is, if you were involved in a war crime, you're complicit. You can be prosecuted. If you can be prosecuted for not resisting the crime, you have sometimes a Nuremberg obligation, a Nuremberg privilege to resist that. And just before we get to you, Ramsey Clark sat in our court under oath and said, first of all, he said, yes, indeed, international law applies in this little do-it court. Yes, indeed, these people have a legal obligation to obstruct the commission of war crimes. First, he said, by any nonviolent means later, by any nonviolent means possible. And then he sort of hedged that and said, well, maybe even as long as the violence isn't greater than the crime. And he said that they have a legal obligation to obstruct it, and they have a legal right to resist it. And incidentally, we have the other First Amendment right to petition our government for redress of grievances. So, was the Nuremberg court a victor's court?
Yes.
Yes. Maybe you say no?
Oh, yes.
So, let me just fill in for you. Why is it a victor's court? Well, first of all, it's a court by the victors. Good. Secondly, none of the U.S., French, or Russian war crimes were tried. But on the other hand, these represented a radical change in international law. So one might take a broader perspective and say, the question isn't just exactly what happened in 1946. The question is, does this represent a victor's court or not? We have the Rwanda trials, we have the, are the Rwanda trials a victor's court? Are the Yugoslavia trials a victor's court? I don't know. Here's what I would propose to you. I would propose to you that whether or not Nuremberg was a victor's court depends on the future. If Nuremberg is used to prosecute war criminals broadly, then it's when it was not a victor's court. And you know what? Whether or not Nuremberg is used to prosecute war criminals broadly is up to us. It's up to us. If we make, and let me carry that one step further. We know that prosecution is typically domestic. If we start trying our war criminals like Cheney, I mean the guy's a nut. And the American people hate him. I think he'd be a pretty good target. I think people would, between Bush and Cheney, I think the American people would go along with trying to get him. So I think that they're vulnerable targets in general. But my point being is if we start prosecuting our war criminals with international law in our courts using the Nuremberg principles, it would not have been a victor's court.
That's why it is a victim's court.
That's why it is a victor's court. It's because we aren't doing it. And I want to just go one step further. You know, I keep talking about democracy is up us to make it happen. Nobody can give you rights. Nobody can give you democracy. You have to take them. But you know, I fall into the trap too. I'm walking around here saying, "Oh yeah, International Criminal Court. I can't believe it. We signed on to it, and then Congress and didn't ratify it, and then Bush unsigned it, so we don't even sign on to it." And I just thought the other day, wait a minute, dude. What are you complaining about? You haven't done anything about it. Get off your dead ass and let's just change it. Let's just tell Congress, sign the damn thing. Make it a treaty. I'm just sitting here moping and complaining about it. Now, there are some justifications for war, damn limited. I mean, under the UN Charter, there's two. Clear and imminent threat of attack. Clear and imminent. And if the Security Council said, okay, you really need to do this.
What about protecting the human rights of Russian speakers in East Ukraine who've been killed by the fascist Ukrainian regime?
You cannot use war crimes to
without a UN order.
No, you can't use war crimes to in retribution for war crimes.
And you go in to stop the war crimes.
You have a right. You have a responsibility to stop the war crimes, but then you have to see. Do we have a right to stop the war crimes? I'm not sure that you do have the right number. I'm not sure the state has the right to stop the war crimes.
Maybe you need a UN declaration to do that.
Well, what you do is you take it to court. I mean, the whole concept of this is to force. The whole concept of this is to force these decisions into a structure of law. That's what this was establishing international law as opposed to the law of the gun. And just as, yes?
You brought up with Nuremberg that one of the elements that came out of it was something that related specifically with peace. I didn't quite get what, maybe you just used the word peace, but was there something that like we have a right to peace or something?
No, we
that
don't.
Came out of Nuremberg?
Under things like the International Human Rights Law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we do. These are some of the things that are outlawed by international law. Disproportional force. What does that mean?
Kill ratio.
Is that?
Kill ratio?
Yeah, or on a more personal level, if he gets mad at me and throws a paper at me, that doesn't mean I can strangle him to death, right?
What Israel's doing to
Because I don't get email.
Okay. Collective punishments.
That's exactly.
What's that? Ron's a real troublemaker. He threw a spitball at me. Everybody in this classroom is going to stay in this class for 2 weeks. I'm going. Or all day. It's not legal. And This is what I found so important. Look at these things. These are the things that really scream out, you know. You can't take resources from unoccupied land. I'm sorry, you go in there, you can't steal them. You can't destroy and remove prohibited cultural items. Remember when George Bush accepted from our soldiers the gold-plated pistol of Saddam Hussein?
Yeah.
It's a violation of international law. Violation of international law. Displacing nationals, you can't move a population into somebody else's land. Changing boundaries by force, you can't change by cruel and unusual treatment. Bounty punishment, also treatment. Human shields, indiscriminate weapons, targeting civilians. And one of the things I was realizing coming out of Gaza was that all those things was just scream out for retribution, scream out for vengeance. And if we could take those things and help people say, okay, just like our court system, we don't think it's fair, but you know, there's some semblance that's going to work out, and we let the court handle it. And if you knew that, okay, this kid was going to go to court, and they were probably going to find him guilty, and they were probably going to punish him, then I wouldn't have to do it myself. I could say, damn, I got burned. It's not going to make it good. It's not going to make it right. It's not going to make it good. But I can let it go, and you don't get this constant escalation as each person does something, and the other side has to have a revenge.
What are we gonna do about it?
Okay, I'm willing to go there. What do we do about it? Yes.
Well, one comment was maybe we got to mobilize millions of people, but to me, it seems that we really have to reach out across the partisan divide and find common ground with those with whom we don't agree, and we have a lot of common discourse and public deliberation to do with regards to where we're at, what our common values are.
How do you know Margaret Mead's quote?
What?
Margaret Mead's quote?
A handful of people can mobilize the world.
Guess we got it?
Yeah.
Never doubt that a few dedicated individuals can't change the world. It could change the world. Make a difference, but indeed it's the only way it's ever happened. And of course, she was not spouting some theoretical nice idea. She was spouting a law of physics. Everything starts with one person. Everything starts with one person. And then you got to build it. And the first thing we have to do is get familiar with international law, get committed to it, get ready to do the arguments, recognize the chain of law. I mean, how can you argue with this stuff? Supreme Court ruling after Supreme Court ruling says it's the case. So I got a couple questions. How do you get 1 million people out there?
Locally, you gotta normalize locally, you gotta start local.
Start local.
Yeah.
But you gotta have an issue that mobilizes, that 1 million people will mobilize on.
Okay, so, yes and then yes.
Margaret Mead also has another quote that's similar to, I remember Buckminster Fuller's quote rather more. So if you want to change things, you don't fight the existing reality, you build a new model that makes the old model obsolete.
That's right.
So that's why I was bringing up the idea that do laws actually work, and if they don't, why would you make more laws?
So I don't have any problem with the idea of changing the whole system, but I also think we can work to change pieces of it. And of course, I'm sort of speaking, you're a lawyer, you speak as a lawyer, I've got many years in elected public office as a politician, so I sort of look at the system and think it can be made to work if people make it work. I think it would work if people make it work. If people demanded that the government serve them, demanded it, then I believe it will happen. If we don't demand it, I can guarantee you it won't. As I told you, I've never gotten off on a international law defense. On the other hand, I do know one thing. If I quit trying, it'll never happen.
But, if you keep on pushing on that, the whole principle of international law, and other people are doing it too, I mean, it brings it to public consciousness.
That's right.
That's right.
And I've educated a lot of judges. I can guarantee you that. Interrupt the conversation. I have some handouts which include a bunch of the international laws. It'll include a memo in support of an in limine motion. So that's a lawyer's statements about why this should be allowed in the court and why it's relevant to the case and happen to do with the case drones, I think, and some other stuff. So if you get your email to me, I'll send that out. There's some stuff on the Nuremberg principles.